Welcome to JavaScript Programming Concept 5. In this video, we're going to explore how we can store large amounts of information in something called arrays, and we're going to learn how we can access the information and do something with it. So let's get to it. So in previous lessons, if you were asked to store 3 grades, you might do something like this, where you create 3 different variables, assigning each of them a value. Now, for 3 grades, that might be perfectly fine. But once the number of grades increases, again, it can be very tedious to have to create all these different variables to store the information and then to actually process the information. So luckily enough, programming languages have this concept of arrays, also sometimes called lists, that allows us to store lots of information, lots of values in one variable. Now, in most languages, I dare to say almost all languages, the square brackets are used to denote this concept of an array. So I can create this one variable grades and simply store the 3 values. And that's it. And if I wanted to store more values, I simply just add to this list of values inside the array. Now let's go ahead and display this variable grades, and let's see what we have in there. And hopefully you're not going to be too surprised by it. So there you go. You can see here we got the 3 grades. Now let's say I wanted to access only one piece of information. I don't want all the grades. I just want, let's say, the first grade. So I'm going to grades 1. And you'll see that it gives us the 90. It doesn't actually give us the 100. And hopefully you can kind of deduce that, well, if this is grades 1, then something to the left of it would be grade 0. And there it is. So it's important to remember that when you work with an array, the first position of that information inside the array is position 0, also sometimes called the index. So let's go ahead and just access all that information. So I'm going to do a little copy and paste. And there you go. So now you can see that we were able to access each piece of information individually. But now let's say we wanted to access all the information and do something with it. So here's where a for loop comes in. So I can start I equal to 0 for the first position. I can do I less than 3, so it makes it all the way up to 2, the last position. And I'm simply going to do an I plus plus. Now I'm going to do a console log of grades bracket. Now I don't want to put a hard number here as like 0, because if I do that, it's simply going to display that first grade of 100 3 times. What we want to have here instead is for this to somehow change from 0 to 1 to 2. And if you kind of remember or recall, that's what the loop variable is doing inside of the for loop. That it's going to start at 0, then it's going to go to 1, and then it's going to go to 2. And you can see here, it displayed the numbers 100 to 80 again. Now, if I was to add more grades, let's say, let's say 70 and 60, unless I modify this variable here of the 3 to now represent 5, we're not going to be able to get all the values. Now, I could do that, but there's a more efficient way of doing it other than using a hard number. And that is to access the array's property of length. And what this actually does, this represents how many elements are in the array. So you can see here, it represents 5. So instead of using a 3 here, I'm going to put this here. And what that lets me do, and I'm going to add a couple more grades here, it lets me add grades to the array, or information to the array, without having to modify the for loop, because the for loop will automatically adjust based off the length of your array. Again, so please, this is definitely the best way to work with this type of for loop and arrays. Now for this next example, I'm going to just comment out some of these things over here. We don't need them. And what I want to do is I want to show you how perhaps we can add up these grades. So I'm going to create a variable called sum. And instead of printing them out, well, maybe I'll print them out as well. I want to add them up. So we're going to use an accumulator. And we're going to say grades bracket I again. So this is a very common thing to do. That if you're using the for loop, you're going to use this type of notation where you're going to use that loop variable in order to access each piece of information. What I'm going to do inside the console log now is to display that sum as well as each of the values in the array. And you can see here, the first time around, sum is 100 because we added 100 to the sum. Remember, sum originally started at 0. And then with each iteration of the loop, we add the next value from the array to that sum. So this became 190, 80 plus 190 is 270, and then so on. Now, a common thing since we're adding up grades is to kind of calculate an average. So let's do that. So we could say sum divided by. Now let's take advantage of the fact that grades.length represents how many grades were in the array. So instead of dividing it by, what do we have here? Looks like 7 grades. Instead of putting the number 7, we'll simply do grades.length. And that way, if we decide to adjust the array, the calculation will also adjust. So let's go through here. Oops, forgot to print it out. Now let's print out AVG. And there we got 70. Now let me prove to you again. Let me remove a couple of grades here. So I removed the 2 lowest grades. And you'll see that the for loop ran fewer times and that the average was calculated correctly. The average is 80, smack in the middle. Now, something else we can do, again, just as another example of a process we can do. What if we needed to calculate, I'm going to put the 50 and the 40 back in there. What if we need to calculate how many grades were failing? So let me go ahead in here and let me adjust this a little bit. Actually, I'll do it as a separate example, just so that this can stay here inside of here. So let's go ahead and copy and paste this. And let's write an if statement. So we're simply going to say if grades bracket I, again, notice that notation again, is less than 65, then let's increase some variable failing by 1. So we're going to do the plus plus. We could have done a plus equals 1 if we wanted to, but I felt this was a little cleaner for us to do. So let's create that variable failing. Let's set it up to be equal to 0 to start off. And now let's simply just display how many grades were failing, which would simply be failing. Now let's just make sure we got everything good. And I guess we could write a nice, this number of grades, 0 failing grades. So let's do it like that. Failing grades. And let's put that in there, and let's run it again now. All right, so we can see here, it says we have 3 failing grades, and let's see, yeah, because the 60 is less than 65. So we got the 60, the 50, and the 40. Honestly, when it comes to the process inside the for loop, working with arrays, everything you've learned so far can be used here. Again, if you're using this as part of web development, guess what? You can use the information inside of arrays to generate HTML on the page. All right, so let's go back to our presentation, review what we've learned. All right, so in this video, we saw how we can store large amounts of information in a concept called arrays. Using a for loop, we were able to access all the elements in an array by simply specifying the array name, bracket, and then that loop variable, typically I. We also learned about how arrays have a property called length that adjusts depending on how many elements are in the array. So hopefully you're excited about being able to process large amounts of information, and enjoy.